mind, Ellie. Just try to keep your critters from pestering Granny. You got her so upset she got into her jug and now she's seeing visions.
What kind of visions?
In 2005, the Steerhouse Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, located in Providence, Rhode Island, would adopt a 6-month-old kitten named Oscar from an animal shelter to help provide comfort to patients who were reaching the end of their lives. At first, Oscar would appear to be a bit standoffish and often hide in the supply closet or could be found hiding under the nursing center's beds. The Steerhouse Nursing Center placed Oscar in the dementia unit, where unfortunately death would be a common occurrence. This is where Oscar would begin to display a peculiar ability, an ability to sense when a patient was about to die. It started out gradually. Oscar would be going about his regular day until he somehow sensed a patient's life was about to near the end. Oscar would come out of hiding, find the patient, and crawl up to them to provide comfort. This would happen a few more times. Whichever patient that Oscar chose to comfort would end up being the next to pass, and the doctors began to take notice. Oscar would continue to display this death-predicting ability, correctly predicting around 20 deaths in a row, with most patients passing within as little as 3 hours of Oscar consoling them. There's even a report that on one occasion, the staff of the Steerhouse Nursing Center believed that a patient was going to pass, but Oscar refused to sit with them. Instead, Oscar chose a different patient who appeared healthy but would ultimately pass away first. Oscar the therapy cat passed away in 2022. Through the course of his 17-year residency at the Steerhouse Nursing Center, he correctly predicted the death of over 100 patients.
What a fine day for a trip to the country.
In September of 1945, in Fruscia, Colorado, farmer Lloyd Olson and his family would be preparing a batch of 40 to 50 Wyandotte chickens for market. Wyandotte chickens are originally known as the American Sea Bright, a dual-purpose breed to farmers as they offer brown eggs and have yellow skin meat. It is a popular show bird as they have many colored variants. To process these chickens, Lloyd would behead them. Then his wife Clara would pluck and clean the chickens. When the chickens are beheaded, it is common for them to flop or stagger for a brief moment before passing. However, on this day, after being beheaded, one lone chicken would begin to run around in circles around the Olsons' yard. Lloyd put the headless chicken in a box on his porch and retired for the evening. The next morning, Lloyd walked outside, and the headless chicken was still alive. Lloyd then decided that he was going to see if he could keep this headless chicken alive. He named it Mike. Lloyd would feed Mike a mix of milk and water with an eyedropper by dripping it into Mike's esophagus, along with small grains of corn and worms. Reports say that Mike the headless chicken was still able to balance on a perch, would walk around clumsily, and would make a gurgling sound in his throat that Lloyd described as the bird's attempt at crowing. Before long, word of Mike the headless chicken would begin to spread, and local folk began to start to show up at the Olson farm to revel in this remarkable chicken. The Olsons would then take Mike to the University of Utah in Salt Lake so scientists could document him. They discovered that the part of the ear, the jugular vein, and the base of the brainstem that controlled motor functions were left intact, allowing Mike the headless chicken to live. Local papers in Salt Lake would spread the news of the headless chicken, and Lloyd would set up a small sideshow so folks around Salt Lake could come and experience Mike the headless chicken. Shortly thereafter, Mike would have his photos taken and be featured in the October 22nd issue of Life magazine in 1945. Lloyd then took Mike to a sideshow attraction on the boardwalk in Long Beach, California. Lloyd would charge 25 cents for a ticket to see the headless chicken, and it's reported that at their peak, they were averaging 600 people a day paying 25 cents apiece. Lloyd would take Mike to sideshows all across the southeast United States, often stopping back at their farm in Fruscia, Colorado, in between shows. The country was fascinated with Mike the headless chicken, and the Olsons would receive many letters from people with various opinions on the chicken, and also be featured in multiple magazines and newspapers. In the spring of 1947, 18 months after Mike the Chicken's beheading, Lloyd and Mike would be at a sideshow in Phoenix, Arizona. After the show, they retired to a motel room for the night, when suddenly Mike the Headless Chicken would begin to choke on mucus. This is an occurrence that would happen from time to time, and Lloyd kept a small bulb syringe to assist the chicken in clearing its throat. However, when Lloyd went to grab the syringe, it was gone. He then realized he had left the syringe back at the sideshow. Lloyd would not be able to clear the chicken's throat, and Mike the Chicken would die.
Hey, that's just great. This young man's never heard of the Coleman frog. Why don't you tell him all about it?
In the spring of 1885, a man by the name of Fred Coleman was in a small rowboat off the shore of Killarney Lake near Fredericton, New Brunswick, fishing for food. Fred was in the middle of fishing when suddenly a frog, estimated at 7 pounds, hopped in Fred's small canoe and began to ribbit at Fred. Fred looked at this giant frog and offered it a piece of cheese. The frog ate it. Astounded by this frog, Fred would take it home and let him roam around in the yard of his lakeshore guest house. The frog seemed to eat anything Fred would feed it, including baked beans, June bugs, cheese, and buttermilk toddies. After time, the frog would continue to grow larger and heavier. Fred would grow close to this frog. Supposedly, he could even sometimes call the frog with a dinner bell and would show him off to his friends, as there are allegedly reports by people who had also seen this frog. Fred Coleman reportedly kept this frog for around 8 years, and the frog would end up weighing around 42 pounds. Unfortunately, this frog would be killed in an alleged dynamite accident, and Fred would send the remains to a taxidermist in Bangor, Maine, and would later display it in a glass case in a hotel that he owned in Fredericton. After some time, Fred too would pass away, and the frog would be taken out of the glass display and used as an ashtray by inebriated patrons of the hotel. Later on, the frog would be donated to the York Sunbury Museum, where they would attempt to repair and repaint the frog. Supposedly the frog looked much better before while it was at the hotel, where its skin was speckled and was claimed to look very much real. In 1988, the frog was sent to the Canadian Conservation Institute, where it underwent 2 years of evaluation, and it was determined that the taxidermy methods on the frog appeared to be consistent with late 19th century techniques. This gigantic frog would come to be known as the Coleman frog and is still on display at the York Sunbury Museum, where it remains preserved to this day.
Oh, preserved!
Like pickled?
In the real sheep country, the herds forage over the hills, watched by a man and a dog.
In 1998, a New Zealand-based sheep farmer named John Purium would begin to start the process of shearing a flock of merino sheep that was allegedly consisting of around 17,000 sheep. However, one single sheep had other plans. This sheep would somehow wander off away from the flock, remaining unsheared. This lone sheep went on to remain unnoticed for 6 years, wandering the countryside, and was even reported to have lived in a cave. In 2004, John was standing on a small bluff when he spotted what he described as an animal resembling a biblical creature. It was the sheep. The sheep was covered in upwards of 60 pounds of wool, having gone unsheared for nearly 6 years. The wool was so overgrown that the sheep was wool blind, meaning it could barely see. It was remarkable that the sheep survived this long, and researchers believe the thick wool may have helped protect the sheep from predators such as wolves. John eventually caught the sheep and brought it back to a shed on his farm, where it is said that the sheep would just bump around off the walls as to being wool blind, and John would arrange to have the sheep sheared. Before the sheep was sheared, however, a teenage pony group club would arrive at the farm and spot the sheep. Fascinated by the overgrown sheep, the group asked John if the sheep had a name. It didn't. One girl would say that the sheep resembled an ogre and they should call it Shrek. They all agreed. John and the group began to talk about contacting the local news. Stephen Jacuri from the Otago Daily Times would arrive on the farm to document Shrek the sheep. They began to photograph Shrek the sheep. When someone bet a man by the name of Daniel Devine that he could not carry Shrek the sheep over his shoulders, Daniel proved them wrong. He slung Shrek over his shoulder, and Stephen took this photo. Within 24 hours, the photo would be on the front page of every newspaper in the country, and some even around the world. New Zealand-based broadcaster Paul Holmes would contact John about having the sheep sheared live on television. A week later, the shearing would take place on CNN and was allegedly broadcast to over 1 billion people. Shrek's overgrown wool coat was said to have weighed around 60 pounds. However, it was largely unusable. Instead of letting the wool go to waste, John would partner with a charity known as Cure Kids. They would go on to make small red boxes with a glass window to put pieces of the wool into and put a brief summary of Shrek the sheep on the box. Some of these boxes sold for upwards of $2,000. After the dust settled, John would take Shrek the sheep back to his farm to live for the following years. John would decide to let Shrek's wool grow out again, and would face a bit of scrutiny because of it. However, John had bigger plans. He wanted to do one more big public shearing. There was news on the radio of these giant icebergs floating up from Antarctica, and John thought that would be the perfect location to have Shrek the sheep sheared. So John, the original photographer Stephen Jacuri, and a blade shearer named Jimmy Barnett would do just that. They arrived via helicopter, lowered Shrek down, and for the last time, Shrek would receive his publicized shearing. It was a risky endeavor, but it ended up going well, and John raised even more money for the Cure Kids charity. Shrek remained on John's farm until 2011, where he died at the age of 16.